So getting this thing started, how would you describe what it is that you do exactly?
Essentially, the entire work revolves around spiritual awakening, the practice of self inquiry. So, in a simple way, I would just say I just help people bring depth to the practice of meditation and overall spiritual understanding of what life really is, who you really are. Yeah.
Mm, all right. How do we do that? Is there like a summary of how you go about doing that? I know it's probably a slightly complicated process, a slightly in-depth process, but could you give us a
Actually, ultimately, anything that is closer to the truth will always be very simple.
mm-hmm,
Only the mind complicates things.
mm-hmm,
So, of course, it requires a deeper look in your experience, to, and what that first requires before we even get into any practice components, and you have to have an openness to the possibility that everything that you currently take to be true and believe to be real and true may not be true. I feel like if we start with that openness, that willingness to conceive of the possibility that, hey, everything that I take to be true may not be so, then it prepares you for meditation. It
yeah,
prepares you for self-inquiry. And self-inquiry is just a deeper look into your experience to see things as they really are. So that really, it consists of three components. Recently I thought of this and I'm like, if I was to just really put it in simple steps or some three categories, like what would self-inquiry come down to? Or even just spiritual practice, what would it really come down to, the essence of it, right? So the first component is definitely silencing the mind, and not like trying to shut the mind up, because it's not the mind that's the problem, but our immersion in the mind is what continues to recreate our belief systems, our ideas,
mm-hmm,
our whole structure of who I am and what life is. So in order to have any clarity, to grow in the understanding of things the way they really are, we have to step out of that, at least for a few moments every day. So
mm-hmm.
the first component of self-inquiry meditation really is about learning to step out of mind, which is concepts about what life is, about who I am, right? These are just stories running in our mind. So the first aspect is learning to disengage from that psychological chatter. Because naturally, when you disengage from the psychological chatter and thoughts aren't telling you what is real, what life is, who you are, when there's no narrative about what life is, then all there is just life as it is.
Mm-hmm.
When you step out of thought, you are simply there. Like, you don't disappear, but no longer is a narrative running about telling you about things, because those are just ideas.
Yeah.
So to really come in touch with life as it is, you have to step out of concepts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first component of it.
Mm.
The second, I would say, is self-observation, right? Like, through just day-to-day life, you have to learn to, rather than just taking yourself to be the person that is acting and thinking and doing, you have to start to objectify that whole process. So it's like you start to see the person as an object of your seeing. You start to observe the processes unfolding of thinking, feeling, doing. Rather than being those processes, you start to observe them
Mm-hmm.
at a distance. Because here you come to know so much. You come to understand so many of your own perceived limitations. You start to become aware of the beliefs you were previously operating under or through. Now they start to be seen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So self-observation is a crucial component of it as well. And last but not least, if anything, the most important aspect of self-inquiry is an ongoing discernment between the self versus the experience that is appearing, the changeless self and changeful experience.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're constantly discerning between what you innately feel as self, or even in a simpler way, we can say discerning between the seer and the seen.
Mm. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Mm.
So all three of these, like, this discernment between the seer and the seen, observing the personal self as an object, and silencing the mind, turning away from concepts, they're all kind of linked. It's not like necessarily distinct steps, but in a way they are also. So it's like they all feed into each other. And I think the overall, that's what the umbrella of the essence of spiritual practice really is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like your third step, the
Mm-hmm.
discernment, because that's what really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Is discerning in changing the way that one acts with this newfound state of being, this new sense of self. That's what really matters, I feel, in the spiritual path. And would you say that? So when we discern, do you feel as though you just naturally act different? Is there a natural flow toward maybe giving back to your fellow human being, treating yourself differently? Like, how would you say in your discernment that Sunny is different?
I think that anybody who genuinely devotes themselves to any one of these three, anybody who genuinely devotes themselves to spiritual practice, which is not at all like even like we like to think of it as a mystical thing, but it's actually very practical. It is very just like learning to look at your experience, and what you want is truth. Mm-hmm. You're not doing this for any necessarily like personal gain or in order to just feel better. You are genuinely interested in understanding the truth of yourself, understanding the truth of your experience. And if anybody has that level of like devotion to any one of these practices, naturally what unfolds from that is like more harmonious thought, speech, and action. Because these are like on the surface level, these are like byproducts. I don't even think that the point of spiritual practice is to create harmonious thought, speech, and action, but that's just a beneficial byproduct that arises naturally, because all of those things that create dysfunction and suffering are rooted in a wrong understanding of who I am. Yeah. They are rooted in limited understanding, in personal identity. So all of our dysfunctional behaviors and thoughts and speech, which create suffering for ourselves and others, it's rooted in personal identity, which is right. Like all those actions revolve around a personal self who is trying to get benefit at the expense of everything else. Mm-hmm. Naturally, as you do this work and you start to understand what you are prior to just the personal self that is appearing in your experience, prior to any experience, you're becoming more established in a universal identity, a greater sense of what you are, which doesn't only encompass like the little person, but rather everything that is appearing. Yeah. So like, I don't think like for maybe a certain while, like especially when we begin the practice, we have to make an effort to act rightly, like for the sake of acting right. But I think anybody who is genuinely observing even their experience and learning from it, they will naturally come to see that, hey, this set of like thoughts and actions create dysfunction and suffering, not only for others, but for myself too. And this set of thoughts and actions create harmony. Mm-hmm. So naturally, it's just more practical to choose that which creates harmony. So I feel like that just happens underneath the surface of our perception. Those types of changes, they just start to unfold as we take meditation more seriously and are genuinely interested in understanding the truth. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Natural harmony. So what would you say holds us back the greatest from understanding our sense of truth?
Immersion in thoughts, because that is where the bondage lies. It is these thoughts which are creating stories and narratives about life. Thoughts can never touch life as it actually is. Yeah. They can only create ideas about something. For example, like even the image that I may have of a table is not a table. It is just an image. It is just an idea about life as it actually is, you see? So it's like, especially when people come to like the spiritual path, the main thing that keeps holding them back is that they run away from the silence, which is ultimately the answer to all their questions. Silence. I don't know, maybe you've heard this, but it's like many teachers say silence is the highest teaching. It is because it truly is. And like in the absence of concepts, you come to naturally understand more and more, right? Your vision becomes clearer, and not like your eyesight, but like your understanding, your like vision with which you perceive. You start to become more subtler in your perception. You pick up on things that previously you weren't picking up on. You start to literally unravel so many ideas that you had that were totally untrue. Like this, I think this whole restructuring process begins to happen just naturally through silence.
Yeah.
And that's really also like the main, one of the main the points of all the work that I do as well, with all the content I make, is helping people understand that. Because I see, a lot of people especially in like non-dual circles and all this whole spiritual community, that they continue to run away from silence. It's not that we're trying to create a ritual of like sit down meditation and like that's the ultimate thing, because I do believe that, hey, all of these things have to be embodied in day-to-day personal life. But I think silence is the foundation upon which, all that is built. So as you said earlier, the point about discernment like resonated with you. Our capacity to discern will be so minimal if we're not allowing ourselves to rest outside of concepts.
Yeah.
Like I think if we are not allowing ourselves to just, every single day for a few moments at least, like letting go of everything, letting go of me and mine, me and my life, letting go of ideas about what I want, future, past, like what has happened, who I'm like, right? Even like letting go of what I want spiritually, like what I want to realize or whatever. When you rest totally free from all motive, all desire, all want, all caring, you're just putting the whole personal mask down. That is where you start to recognize your oneness of identity with the whole. That is where you start to really touch life as it really is. It sounds abstract, but it's actually quite practical.
Yeah, it does sound abstract to anyone that has no idea, that's just listening, right? They're like, well, I got to pay the bills, man. I got things to do. But it is very practical, right? To be able to do this and tap in to the stillness. All it takes, man, is to just disconnect. Go find a quiet place and breathe for a little bit, and you can feel it. But you have to stay dedicated to it to a certain extent. You have to be very vigorous in one's practice, especially in the beginning, I feel. That's personally speaking. Would you say the same thing? Do you recommend just, to somebody getting started on this path, practice regularly, even if it's just for maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes a day?
Actually, to everybody that I work with, and even on my channel, like if they're really willing and they're wanting to grow in this, then I tell them to have a foundational practice of you sit down twice per day for 20 to 30 minutes each. If you really think that's a lot, like if someone does think that's a lot, then I say at least start with one session. But the thing is, you have to do your best to do it every single day. And it has to be consistent over a long period of time, because especially in the beginning, because we are so entangled in our concepts and our mental resistances and our cravings and impulses, that like the mind will very cunningly continue to try to convince you of like of how you don't need to do it, or you shouldn't do it, or like, it's uncomfortable. Yeah. It's just, and it's constantly looking for progress and measuring this and that. But it's like with meditation, it's not necessarily linear. And also, especially in the beginning, a lot of like the quote unquote gains are happening underneath the surface of your perception. You don't actually understand the difference until it hits you like in the face, and you see that like in a way, nothing is different like on the surface, but like you see that nothing is the same. You're way lighter. Your perception is clearer. you feel more connected, you feel more alive, you feel more peaceful. So those are like the beginning aspects of beginning stages of it, right? Like you're just in it to like as almost like a safe haven. You want to feel more
Yeah,
peaceful
yeah.
and you want to have clarity. But
Mhm.
that starts to grow, like this bug of the desire for self-knowledge, the desire for truth begins to grow within you.
Yep.
And so even if like let's say someone leading a very busy life and they're worried about the practical stuff, and I'm like, hey, you don't got to give up any of that stuff. Like when you're being asked to sit in silence for even let's say you want to start just 15 minutes a day, like that takes away nothing from the way you normally live your life. So
Yeah.
to such a person, I would recommend, hey, like do whatever you want, as you are living right now, but you just start implementing this once in your day.
Mhm.
And naturally through that, like that is your window where like a deep wisdom will start to grow within you and it will start to take over everything else.
Yeah. Mhm.
People want to like get into meditation and they don't want to do the meditation, but it's like they want to be able to practice spontaneously throughout the day, right? Like
Yeah.
they're like, oh
Mhm.
no, I practice while I'm doing this and that. No, like you
Mm.
try that, you do that, but it's like, especially in the beginning, if you don't have that foundation where you are away from everything and you are just simply going within yourself, then like again, your capacity to even practice during the day-to-day stuff, or especially when you're in a difficult situation, hectic situation, or like a life crisis, the capacity to practice during those moments will be absolutely minute.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
to just a practical way to go about it, that's why I just sort of like always preach making it a consistent practice where you do sit down, because I know that from there the whole thing grows, and then you don't have to be so ritualistic about it.
Mhm.
But then you don't even look at it as a chore. You're just consistent because you see the benefit of it and you see that like you can't even live without it in a way at a
Yeah.
certain point, because you see that like the world continues to just entangle you, and without a proper foundation of silence you get lost in the hecticness of the world and the person.
Well said. Now, would you say once we lay the foundation that eventually we do live in stillness and we do bring that foundation of stillness into the goings on of our life?
Yeah, absolutely. As
Mm.
we create a proper foundation, not so firstly is like our desire for truth grows, and as our desire for truth goes, then we genuinely look forward to the practice and we want to do it more, and we see it as a doorway to truth, right? Because like our thoughts aren't leading you to spiritual understanding. You start to see how like concepts cannot grasp it, so you have to surrender to silence. You have to surrender your thoughts to silence and
Yeah.
simply be. So as you start to do that, you naturally become more and more aware of the changeless presence, which is always as it is, never more, never less, regardless of what experience is arising in this moment, whether that is sitting in meditation or being in a marketplace with your family or doing work. So you start to become more aware of that changeless, ever present self, which is always as it is. And that
Mhm.
is ultimately the essence of meditation. You are discovering a new dimension of being. You are discovering a new depth to what you are. You start to see that everything I take myself to be, along with the world that I'm experiencing, it is a constantly changeful experience in my seeing, not the person seeing. The person itself is being seen to change, while I am not changing. So you see, your understanding of self is growing subtler, deeper,
Yeah.
and it's not something that is being maintained, right? The person's always trying to maintain awareness and whatnot. You
Yeah.
start to, as you start to like, as you practice more, we start to see that the self that is aware is not being maintained because it is never more or less. It is simply here. It is that which is present. It is in the presence of self where this experience is currently appearing to be like so true and real. But in a few moments, this experience will no longer be real. So something else will be appearing to be real. And then soon that will know. So you see, like everything that is experienceable is just an appearance that is changing. All that is ultimately real is the self, which is present. And in its presence, the experience that is currently being illumined appears to be real. It's not the experience that is real. It is the presence which enlivens it. The presence is what we call the now. The now is the presence of the self that we are.
Yeah.
So we start to get more in, we can call it get more in touch with, but it's just like you start to realize that that is your true identity.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to no longer attribute a great sense of identity and self to the mental process, the emotional process, the personal action.
Yeah.
Everything starts to be more and more seen to be an experience that is appearing. Yeah. It is like a life story being displayed, but it's no longer like self. It is no longer me and mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. That was well said, man. Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's what like a lot of the great sages you may hear, they say that the greatest hindrance to your spiritual growth is this idea, me and mine. Mm-hmm. This idea I, right? Like what you take I to be and everything that revolves around that, like your whole life and all that stuff, like that is the idea that has to be given up. Mm-hmm. So I always say to people like, hey, don't worry about like maintaining this or like what, because instantly the mind starts doubting and questioning and resisting. Like, how can I maintain this? I'm like, don't worry about any of that. Just in this moment, can you just for this moment let go of attributing so much significance to what happens to you?
Yeah.
Right? Like to your personal self. Can you just let all thought, all motivity, all intention go? Because when we let that go, we discover our, just like, okay, I usually ask like, okay, when you let all that go, what remains? You know, like when thought is not there to tell you who you are, who are you? As what do you remain?
Ultimate freedom. Peace.
Yeah, you see, like the mind can describe it in any way, but it's like ultimately even those labels don't matter. But it's like when all that is let go of, you just are what you are in essence. Yep. And that's like the main teaching of Ramana Maharshi. He says in this, right, knowledge in this practice, like knowledge of the self is not like typical knowledge. You don't know the self as something. Here, to know the self is the same as being the self. Right. So it's like when we drop all those descriptions, you are already the self that you are already what you are, but you don't know yourself as an object because any object you could know is also a changeful experience. That is not you. So you can't objectify the self. You can't see it through the instruments of eyesight, smelling, all, like the sense perceptions or even thought, because all those are experiences being seen by you. Mm-hmm. When you let go of immersion in all sense perceptions and all thoughts and all experience, you simply are what you are. And you start to grow in your clarity with which you see that. Yeah. You start to be the self. And in other words, to be is to know. To know is to be.
Yeah. That's good. To be is to know. To know is to be. Mm-hmm. I like that one. Wow. So would you say sages like Ramana, they live in this state? They are this state. They are truth. They are walking embodiment of truth for all of us to see and to not only see in themselves, but also to reflect and embody in ourselves as well.
Yeah, we could say that personally, right? Like for us to say that, we have to step in the idea that, hey, I am a person and Ramana is another person, or this teacher is another person, and they are living embodiment of truth. But it's funny when such questions are asked to such teachers and sages, are you always in that state? You know, you often hear them say that like, that state is the only thing that actually is, you know, even you are in that, you are that right now. Yeah. So you see this like spiritual quest is not about attaining something that you don't have. It's not about achieving a state that you currently don't have. It is simply about removing ignorance. escaping the grasp of ignorance, so and that is why we have to step out of concepts, because concepts are the creator of ignorance, right? Meaning concepts make things appear to be something else. They make a life appear to be something other than it actually is. When we start to step out of concepts, we start to really experience life as it is. A silent clarity that is beyond all practical insights of the mind, like that starts to take over. Yeah.
Yeah. So even step out of the concept of another person that is stepped out of concept.
Yeah. I mean, like, again, like that is it's funny, right? Because it's so simple, but it's like, that is where we have our hardest challenge, because we have so much sense of importance invested in concepts, in our assumptions and our beliefs. So we have a hard time with that. But that's where the meditation practice helps. It gradually just helps you detach from concepts, helps you outgrow the unconscious importance that you attribute to concepts and beliefs. So yeah, like in meditation, we just let it all go. Let it all go and continue to see what remains. Yeah. And meditation. Any teacher, they all say that, like, you may take me to be the body, but like that is your idea of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well said. Meditation, major key. To anyone listening, there's only so many podcasts that one can listen to. There's only so many YouTube videos that one can watch. It's not going to do it for you. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I recommend just meditate earnestly.
Yeah. With this, it's almost like, the videos we watch and these types of talks. I mean, one, we engage in them because that is our area of interest, right? And they're fun. Why not? There's no harm in it. But it's like, if we feel like we're going to eventually stumble upon a video that is going to have the answer, that is incorrect. And that is just deluding yourself. And constantly, like, people only relying on talks or guided meditations, you will see that, like, in the moment, they have some profound effect, right? And they feel they resonate and they give you some momentary clarity. But gradually, the effect of those words, no matter how many times you watch that video again and again, like they will wear out, and you will always find yourself seeking the next pointer, the next word, the next talk. You see, the mind will always need more. Whereas in silence, you start to discover that which has no concept of more or this or that. Like, there's just a inner intelligence which begins to grow. So that's why it is so necessary. Like, then we can engage in these talks and watch videos and read books for our enjoyment. And also they support our practice. They continue to refresh things, give us new perspectives, give us new angles into how to approach it. And they plant certain seeds, like spiritual seeds. Yeah. Teachings we may not understand, but then in silence, those seeds, like those words are digested. I refer to silence as like creating the proper environment for the seed to grow. So silence is like you watering the plant, like giving it sunlight and all that stuff until it naturally grows into like a giant tree of wisdom. So there has to be a good balance, right? Like conceptual learning and freedom from concepts. Ultimately, like if one has to do only one, then right, freedom from concepts, because it'll still take you there. But concepts alone cannot do it. Yeah.
It just brings up the classic adage of don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. All the talks that I give or anything that I may share, I do my best to make it like just a pointing. Yeah. Exactly. I'm not interested in conceptualizing about things. Like I always try to keep my content tailored around only pointing to directly into the direct experience. Yeah. So that way it actually has some benefit, because, and when I get questions that are too conceptual, sometimes I will just, like not answer them, or tell them also to see the thing in a new way. Because once again, like we can talk about concepts for hours, but a moment of silence is more helpful than an hour of conversation over concepts. Yeah.
Yeah. Very true. Damn. Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, well, why am I doing these things? You know, I've done over 100 or so podcasts. It's like, how much more do I have to speak about this and say the same thing over and over again? You know?
Yeah, I feel that way sometimes too. But that's what's beautiful about it too, you know, like the teaching continues to express itself in an infinite number of ways. You always feel like, hey, I've said enough, but it's like it continues to dance in more creative and beautiful ways. And that's awesome, you know, like that's why this should continue. Like, you know, there's a quote by a great Indian sage, Ramakrishna. He says, like, if you are, like, for an earnest seeker, if you are to think or speak about something, speak about God, speak about truth. So it's like, of course, this must continue, but as long as it is followed by a genuine devotion for truth and surrender into silence, then spiritual knowledge really sprouts. Wisdom naturally sprouts.
Well said. I feel as though once one is on this wavelength of stillness, touching upon the stillness, then from there, it's just a matter of staying aligned with that in one's life, however we go about it. Regular meditation, most likely, is how we go about it. But the hardest part, per se, is getting that taste. I feel as though even just having that sense, that slight glimpse into a greater sense of being, that, to me, I feel as though is the next step that humanity has to cross. The next step that we have to take is knowing that there is a different way to see ourselves, right? Getting out of the illusion of concepts, it's like a prison of concept. But once you do, and you know there is a way out, you can't see another way, you know? So what do you say is the number one way, or a few ways, that we get out of this conceptual framework of sense of self, you know, the conceptual self? Like, what gets people aligned with this?
Suffering.
Yeah, definitely.
Nothing can do it other than suffering, you know? And so, like, notice that, like, you can't do it for anybody. I can't do it for anybody. Nobody can do it for anybody. It has to come from within. So, you know, there's a teaching by the Buddha. He says, even hearing about enlightenment is a great blessing. You know, it's like, so this has to come from within, from life itself, from God itself. You can't turn anybody onto the path when it's not their time. Like, I just think about also my life, that I was on such a different path that there's nobody or nothing they could have done or said to me that would make me care about going deeply into this search for self-knowledge. It's just not possible. Like, I had to, like, your mental pride, your belief system, your arrogance of like doership, you being the doer of your life and being in control, like, that all has to be broken down by suffering over time. When you start to realize your own limitations, you start to realize that life is not the way that you took it to be. And you start to question, like, because only when you're in that state, you start to question, what is this? What is life? That is the beginning of your spiritual journey. And then as long as that flame of self-discovery is burning brightly within you, you continue to penetrate deeper and deeper. Yeah,
it's interesting when you put it that way. Suffering is the beginning of the spiritual journey.
Yeah, suffering until it breaks you down to the point where you're like, okay, what is life? Who am I? Is this it? Like, that is the beginning. Because, you know, people suffer for years, but it's like they may not necessarily come to this. But when suffering really breaks you down to that point where your belief and the foundations and structures of conditioned like reality, as it, like, when those crumble, that's when you become open, right? When we started this talk today and you asked me, like, what is necessary for to understand yourself, I said, before we even begin with the practice, you have to start with an openness to the possibility that everything you take to be true may be untrue.
Yeah.
So I think that suffering, that's what it does to us. And that's why in that case, it is beneficial.
Interesting.
It's not pleasant, but it is beneficial.
Yeah.
And you probably can attest to that fact that like any period of suffering that you've ever had in your life has made you realize the deepest things, like have made you wiser, have made you grow in ways that like pleasure could not have, because pleasure often only binds us further into illusion and pride, you know. Suffering does the opposite.
Yeah. Suffering opened me up to new potential possibilities of finding the so-called happiness in life, because I tried to find it in other things, as we all do, the comings and going of life, trying to find it in the pleasures, and it didn't last, you could say. Never added up to what to the American dream. So I don't know when it started. There was probably some specific point, but it was a point sometime where everything switched, and it had to do with meditation. It was around meditation. It was around the time when I was getting into meditation, and it just allowed me to see that it's it's a fruitless endeavor to chase happiness, peace, joy, whatever you want to call it, in the conceptual framework of living. Ever since then, I've been on a different wavelength, and it was because of suffering, man. Just general mental illness, to be honest with you. I think that's why a lot of people are mentally ill. We have misplaced priorities on how to go about finding so-called happiness, peace, stillness. And it's the mental illness is it's a symptom that eventually will, I think, lead us to the promised land, lead us to a sense of openness so that we can reside in the sense of stillness. But I don't know. What's it going to take for all of us to get the message? Just more suffering, I guess, unfortunately. I guess we suffer until we get the message, right? Is that it?
Well, yeah, exactly. Like in Buddhist teachings, suffering is one of the characteristics of experience.
Yeah.
So the three characteristics are impermanence, right? Everything, not just the external world, but also everything you take yourself to be, they say, right? Buddha says, observe. Everything is impermanent. You can't even find any solidity, any stability in your idea of yourself. Even your idea of yourself, which is your personality, who you are as a person, even that is a changeful experience. Of course, the body is changeful experience, but even like down to your mental core of like your conceived identity, even that is a changeful experience, equally as changeful as the world that we perceive. And the second characteristic of experience is that there's no self in experience. Like nothing, no sensation, no thought, no feeling, no sense perception, nothing you can see, hear, taste, touch, feel, think is the self. And that brings the third characteristic, which is identification with experience is the root cause of suffering. Like it creates suffering. So suffering is inherent in experience when one takes it oneself to be that. Because out of personal identity is born craving and aversion, wanting of something or a resisting of something. That is the essence of where suffering is born. And so if you ever go to like a Vipassana retreat or something like that, like you'll see like that's the main teaching. Hey, observe without judgment. Because when you observe without judgment, you are breaking down this mental structure of craving and aversion. Because even your craving and aversion start to come under your observation. Previously, they were you. You were the craver and the resistor, and right, you were the sufferer. But now the sufferer becomes objectified in your seeing, and you see that I am not that. Even that starts to become objectified as transient, changeful experience.
Yeah.
And the more clear we become in this, the more free we become from suffering, and the
Yeah.
more we are becoming established in our true identity.
Mm-hmm.
So suffering in that way is extremely beneficial.
Mm.
For you, it was like mental, but like for me, it was physical, right? Like my whole physical health broke down when I was in my teens, like 15, 16, I think.
Mm.
And that went on for a lot of years. It was deeply suffering. So you first broke down physically, then emotionally and mentally also.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in the beginning, for me, it was just about like healing myself, right? So when some personal development teachings and beginner spiritual teachings started to come to me, it was all just about healing and becoming better. Yeah. And then that's why they lit me on fire, because I noticed that like I was getting better as I started to change the way I think and conceive of my situation, and I started to meditate. But then my journey became more about like, like I went from a broken ego, like a weak ego, to like strong ego, right? I wanted to gain more. I wanted to be successful. I wanted to, achieve this and that. Soon into that process, like when I did start to get some results, like as we talked earlier, like for the first few years, I didn't get any results for the work I was doing. But like once I started to get the results and I started to make money and all that stuff, I became very prideful. But I noticed a restlessness in my mind that would not go away. It was always afraid of losing what I gained. Yeah. And it was always endlessly craving more. And I started to also see the people in the circles that I was in, like the entrepreneur circles I was in, that like, no matter how much, like these people were making like 50 times more money than me at that time. But it's like, no matter how much money they had, I noticed within them, it's like, they're constantly just wanting more and more and more. Mm-hmm. And then once I went on like a vacation, and I was, it was a beautiful island, right? Like, and it was very private beach, like literally nobody there other than me and my partner, and we were there. And she was like a little away, so I had a moment to myself, and I was like in crystal clear blue water and just like floating, and it was a blissful experience. But even in that experience, I noticed that my mind was like worrying about, like my business or work, or like what I have to do when I get home, or like what's my next step. And I'm like, hey, even in this like blissful experience where I don't need any worry, I don't need to think about, like, still mind is just worried, restless. Yeah. That was my beginning into self-inquiry, because I started to realize that like, no matter what I achieve, no matter what experience I have, it's not the answer. Coincidentally, like the next month, the book Who Am I by Ramana Maharshi came into my experience. And like I think that was the beginning of the end for my like just chase for success or personal seeking. It all became, that's when my life genuinely started to become more tailored towards the search for truth.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool, because we think of suffering as being this dark, decrepit state. And it was for you, I guess, when you were young, but you were still suffering amidst having this beautiful
Everybody
life.
Is. Yeah. Everybody is. Everybody that we, and like you could watch these like Netflix shows where like all these people are like, like the my wife watches like this show, there's a real estate show, and they're so rich and they have all the things, but it's like they're suffering. Yeah. Like that's the fact, like that's an unescapable fact of experience, as right it says in the Buddhist teachings. You cannot escape the suffering until you have a deeper look at yourself and understand yourself as you really are. Personal identity equals suffering. There's no way to get out of that. There's no way to escape that fact.
Yeah.
Suffering may be intense, or it may be minute, like that restlessness that I spoke of, but it is suffering regardless. And only when one really starts to observe that and gets sick of it, totally intolerant of it, then they are open to the search for truth. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we enter the stream.
Yeah.
Wow, well said, man. I don't know where else to go from here, to be honest. I think that's a good note to wrap this thing up at. Unless you have something else to say. Do you have anything else you want to say?
Nothing. I mean, I always just say, like, if this talk resonated, if any real like spiritual talk resonates with you, do your best to embody it. don't just let it be a talk that you hear that
Yeah.
temporarily maybe resonates with you and then you just forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have to do our best to embody the truth in our day-to-day lives. Even the things we realize in meditation and awaken to, then we have to embody those. Like we have to live in alignment with what we come to realize.
Yeah.
And the more we do that, the more is bestowed upon us. That's just, I'm speaking from my experience that like the more I devote myself to this, the more clarity and wisdom and understanding is bestowed upon me.
Mm-hmm.
And like the more that happens, don't take ownership over it. Don't take pride over it. Right.
Yeah.
Because that will just continue to feed your idea of yours. Like, right. The mind comes in and it's like, oh, I'm wise now. But you see how silly that that is, because like you did nothing for the teaching to come into your experience.
Mm-hmm.
You did nothing for for this path to come to you. It just happened, right? When it was time. And so you are also doing even like the interest to watch a talk like this, even the desire to sit in meditation. It's all coming from a power that is vaster than your mental intelligence. Mm-hmm. You're not doing it. You are simply the instrument of that. You are simply, that's just a story that is appearing. Yes. So all the things you come to realize and awaken to are also not yours, because there is no, like the one on behalf of whom we are claiming these realizations is not the self. Mm-hmm. You know, the person didn't create it. The person doesn't. So yeah. So that's also my advice to everybody that is resonant towards this message, is that maintain a deep devotion to truth in your heart and remain deeply humble, right? Like, there's a quote by Hanuman. He's like he's speaking to Ram, so it's like an Indian mythology. And he says to Ram, and he's like, so Ram is like the supreme, Godhead, whatever. And he's speaking to him as like, when I feel that I'm separate from you, I am your servant. When I when I take myself to be like my form, I am your servant. When I take myself to be the soul, I am a spark of your divine light. And when I know myself as I really am, you and I are one, right? I am one in identity with you. So going about this spiritual path and like doing your best, it's like remain deeply humble. Mm-hmm. And all will be bestowed upon you. That's just the way that I see it. It just removes that mental obstacle of pride. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. J. Ram. Thank you very much. Sonny, man, you got away with words. Keep doing your thing. I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your time, effort, and wisdom with all of us. I felt a little unclassed. I just wanted to sit back and listen to you talk on this one. So thank you for coming on here. It's been an honor, man.
Yeah, thanks for your interest in meeting up and interviewing me as well. Best of luck with your endeavor. As long as you're having these awesome talks, I know not only are other people going to be benefited by it, but I think you're going to continue doing great work. So that's awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you, man. Thank you for anybody that listened this long. And peace and love. Peace and love to everybody.